And why do we have to ignore it? The reason we have to ignore it is because it doesn't fit their theory. The inventory stela tells us that the Sphinx was already standing and already remotely ancient when Khufu, the predecessor of Khafre, came to the throne. And if the inventory stela is correct, then the Egyptologists must be wrong, and Khafre could not have built the Sphinx. But, say the Egyptologists, the inventory stela doesn't date from the same period as the Sphinx, and this is true. The inventory stela dates from about 1200 years after the orthodox dating for the Sphinx. The orthodox dating for the Sphinx is 2500 BC, and this stela belongs to the period of 1200 BC, or perhaps a little bit later. They say, since it's not contemporary with the Sphinx, we don't need to pay attention to it. But yet, with that amazing double standard for which Egyptologists are the world leaders, they base their attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre on another piece of text which also is not contemporary with the Sphinx and in which in fact dates from the same period as the inventory stela. They base the attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre on this stela, which is called the Dream Stela, and it was put up by Pharaoh Thutmose IV to commemorate a restoration campaign that he undertook on the Sphinx. And on this stela, amongst many other interesting texts which Robert will review, there is one single syllable, Kaf. And because of that single syllable and nothing else, the monument is attributed to Khafre by Egyptologists. They wish us to believe that Thutmose was telling us that Khafre had built the Sphinx, that he was commemorating the building of the Sphinx by Khafre. He might equally well have been telling us that Khafre was an earlier restorer of their attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre on another piece of text which also is not contemporary with the Sphinx and in which in fact dates from the same period as the inventory stela. They base the attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre on this stela, which is called the Dream Stela, and it was put up by Pharaoh Thutmose IV to commemorate a restoration campaign that he undertook on the Sphinx. And on this stela, amongst many other interesting texts which Robert will review, there is one single syllable, Kaf. And because of that single syllable and nothing else, the monument is attributed to Khafre by Egyptologists. They wish us to believe that Thutmose was telling us that Khafre had built the Sphinx, that he was commemorating the building of the Sphinx by Khafre. He might equally well have been telling us that Khafre was an earlier restorer of the Sphinx, or he might not have been referring to Khafre at all, because it's just a single syllable Kaf. So, on such flimsy foundations, perhaps the most important monument of the ancient world has been attributed for the last century or so to a particular pharaoh in a particular epoch. We think that it's vastly, vastly older than that. And I'm not going to go into the details of that. Robert will give all the details in his talk on Keeper of Genesis. But what I will briefly mention is the geology. Between 1991 and 1993, the Sphinx was studied by Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, a leading geologist and one of the world's recognized specialists in the weathering of limestone. And he was brought to the site by our colleague John Anthony West, who had noticed these curious erosional features on the side of the Sphinx, and particularly prominently on the trench of bedrock out of which the Sphinx is cut, which obviously was made at the same time as the Sphinx. This undulating profile, scalloped undulating profile, and these vertical fissures that run down through the rock could not have been caused by sand erosion, and they could not have been caused by wind erosion. They could only have been caused by one thing, and that is exposure to a very, very, very long period of heavy rainfall. And Professor Robert Schoch has put his reputation on the line, and he's subsequently been endorsed in this matter by hundreds of fellow geologists and opposed by very few, when he says that what we're looking at on the Sphinx, these by the way are later restoration blocks, what we're looking at on the Sphinx and on the surrounding trench is classic precipitation-induced weathering. The problem is that in 2500 BC, when the Sphinx is supposed to have been built, Egypt was as bone dry as it is today. The climate conditions did not exist then, and they have not existed since, to cause this kind of weathering around the Sphinx. The last time that sufficient rains fell in the eastern Sahara to have caused such weathering when the Sahara Desert was still green was around the end of the last ice age, focusing us back again towards that period, that mysterious period when the ice age came suddenly to an end around 12,000 years ago. Sooner or later, as you go around the world, as I did, looking at these sites, at the myths, at the monuments, at the memories that have been passed down, at the fingerprints of what becomes more and more real as a great lost civilization, you have to begin to ask yourself, if I'm finding the fingerprints, where is the body? Where is the rest of this civilization? Why do we find so little? And I'm convinced that the answer to this question lies in the cataclysm that brought the last ice age to an end. And as I said earlier, the ending of the last ice age is an enormous geological mystery, and we do not really understand what brought it to an end. But when you have millions of square miles of 2-mile thick ice melting in just a couple of thousand years, you are by definition looking at a cataclysm. We live on a planet that revolves around a star. In fact, the Earth is revolving around the Sun at 66,600 miles per hour, which means that we've traveled well over 70,000 miles tonight while I've been talking. If you stand on the equator of the Earth, you're spinning with the rotation of the Earth at 1,000 miles per hour. And our planet is subjected to the gravitational pull of the Moon that circles around it, and of neighboring planets in the solar system, and of the Sun itself. With all this massive rotational centrifugal activity, once you become conscious of it, you begin to realize how fragile our environment may really be. And back in the 1950s, a radical theory was proposed to explain the end of the last ice age by Professor Charles Hapgood in the United States. And Hapgood's theory of Earth crust displacement was endorsed fully at the time as to its physics by Albert Einstein. The theory has never been accepted by orthodox geologists, and I'm not sure if it's right, but I think it's worth consideration. Broadly, what Hapgood and Einstein were arguing is that from time to time, the entire outer crust of the Earth can move, shift in one piece around the body of the Earth. And when this happens, land that is in cold parts of the planet, close to one or other of the poles, and thus naturally covered by ice, is moved cataclysmically into warmer parts of the planet, and thus naturally melts very, very rapidly. And at the same time, land that's in warm parts of the planet is shifted into colder parts of the planet. And as I said earlier on, the work on Earth crust displacement that Hapgood and Einstein did has subsequently been refined in a very interesting manner by Rand and Rose Flemath in Canada, whose book, When the Sky Fell, I would urge everybody to read, because it's the most detailed analysis of the Earth crust displacement theory. What this theory offers is an explanation for the sudden ending of the Ice Age. Broadly speaking, it happened, Einstein said, because of the asymmetrical distribution of ice around the poles, the massive buildup of ice at the poles, and all these spinning rotational forces. Sooner or later, a trigger moment is reached, and the precessional wobble of the Earth comes into it, which causes all that asymmetrically deposited ice, that massive weight of ice, to exert sufficient thrust on the crust of the Earth to set the whole crust in motion. And such an idea does explain how we lose a whole civilization, indeed how we lose a whole continent on which such a civilization might have grown up. Because according to the Earth crust displacement theory, the continent of Antarctica, which features in all those ancient maps, was not 17,000 years ago where it is today. Prior to the displacement of the crust, it was much further north, and the Antarctic Peninsula would have been entirely deglaciated and would have offered a comfortable environment for a high civilization to grow up. Then this shifting of the crust, which brings the so-called Ice Age to an end, moves Antarctica dead center onto the Antarctic Circle, and gradually the ice begins to build up over that continent, burying the remains, the body of that great lost civilization. As I say, I don't know if the Earth crust displacement theory is correct. All I do know is that something awful happened to the Earth at the end of the last ice age. Maybe it isn't Earth crust displacement. Maybe it's some kind of more radical pole flip which involves the whole Earth moving in space. Maybe it's something to do with our cosmic environment. Recent evidence has come out of a giant comet striking the Earth at around that period, at around the 10th millennium BC. And such a comet, scientists are now seriously arguing, may have been at the root of the worldwide traditions of deluge and disaster that I review in Fingerprints of the Gods. And, well, if we're not all busy exploring Australia from 599 pounds, many of us might have been aware that an enormous meteor recently whizzed by the Earth at a very close range. Such a meteor, were it to strike our planet, would have the capacity to set in motion a nuclear winter, to end civilization as we know it, to force us all to begin again, those of us who survived. The earliest surviving mention of the lost continent of Atlantis was passed down to us by the Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato got his information, he said in the Timaeus, from Solon, an earlier Greek philosopher. And Solon, in turn, and lawmaker, got his information from an Egyptian priest, a priest of Sais in the Delta. And what that priest said, referring to records going back more than 9,000 years before his time, was this. He said that our Earth is periodically visited by a gigantic cataclysm, and that every time this happens, mankind is forced to begin again like children, with no memory of what went before. And I suspect, I really do, that that's what we are. We're a species with amnesia. We're children who've forgotten our own parents. But those parents who were destroyed in that great cataclysm at the end of the last ice age, I'm now certain that some of them did survive, and that they settled in places like the high Andes, and most prominently of all in Giza, where the three great pyramids and the great Sphinx stand. And they, Robert and I are now convinced, found a way to pass down the memory of who they were and of the special, wondrous knowledge that they had to the future. They found a way to wake us up again. They created a kind of alarm clock for the planet, a beacon that would draw people towards it, and at the right time, when conditions were right, would wake us up. And when I look around the world today, amidst all the turmoil and killing and disaster, I also see a sign of hope. I see a great awakening of consciousness amongst open-minded people everywhere. I think that ancient beacon is working. I think the message that it has sent down the ages is beginning to come through loud and clear. And what Robert and I have tried to do in Keeper of Genesis is get to grips with the beginning of that message, begin to decode it, as Robert will be telling you when he gives his talk in about 10 minutes' time. Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Graham Hancock, ladies and gentlemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Bauval was born in Alexandria, Egypt in 1948. He came to Britain in 1967, where he completed his higher education. After graduating in construction engineering in 1973 in London, he worked in various parts of Africa and the Middle East until 1985. In 1986, he began his research into the pyramid texts, the Giza monuments, and their association with astronomy. His thesis on the correlation between Orion and the Giza pyramids was published in the academic journal Discussions in Egyptology in 1989-1990. His first book, The Orion Mystery, was an international bestseller and translated into 12 languages. His latest book, Keeper of Genesis, co-authored with Graham Hancock, of course, has become yet another bestseller. Despite travelling the world in his quest for knowledge, Robert Bauval lives happily with his wife and 2 children in tranquil Buckinghamshire, here in England. A long way from the pyramids and sands of Egypt, perhaps, but they, I'm sure, are never far from his thoughts. At the end of Robert's presentation, he will be joined here by his close friend and colleague, Graham Hancock, and together they will make a brief announcement before showing you a unique short videotape. But it's now time to digest yet further startling revelations and, I might add, marvellous images from a man whose literary talents have made him a household name, quite literally, throughout the world. Ladies and gentlemen, your appreciation, please, as you welcome Mr. Robert Bauval.
Well done, Graham, well done. People ask me, how did Graham and myself get together? It's rather a long story, and I'm told I don't have much time tonight. But the meeting point was through our agent in London, Mr. Bill Hamilton. And I got a phone call from Bill Hamilton one day in early '93, and he said, "Hey, would you like to meet Graham Hancock?" I said, "Great, I'd love to, the man of the sign of the seal." But he said, "You'll enjoy that. He is a bit like you, you're both the same, you've traveled around the world, you're intrigued in all these mysteries, but there is something, I'm sure, Robert, that you'll be keen to know. He can talk as much as you can." I said, "I've got to see that." And indeed, well, I say we're almost at par, and we become very good friends. It's been 3 years, we've been working together, and it's through the friendly cooperation and respect, mutual respect that we have for each other that Keeper of Genesis has come to be. Fingerprints of the gods. Graham has made a most compelling case that in our remote and dark past, a lost civilization left its mark, its fingerprints, all over the world, in the forms of myths, maps, legends, and most impressively in the forms of huge monuments. Most striking, the most awesome of these fingerprints is surely the Giza necropolis in Egypt, where today stand the 3 great pyramids and the Sphinx. Now, there is a curious tradition, curious legends, stories. Indeed, even the ancient Egyptians themselves speak of survivors of the gods that made their way to Egypt long, long before their own civilization matured. And there brought with them a legacy of knowledge, of wisdom. And underneath the Giza necropolis, somewhere below where stand the 3 great pyramids and the Sphinx, was buried or concealed hermetically this body of knowledge in the form of sacred writings, in the form of records, possibly a hall of records from this lost civilization. Now, all Egyptologists, archaeologists, philologists, every single ist on this planet rejects this sort of theories, this sort of stories. To them, this is merely myth, legends, not worthy of any attention. But as you will see, we believe that this particular myth is rooted in reality. And what I will endeavor to do tonight is to take you on a quest. The whole idea is for you to join me, and of course Graham, on this quest for the hidden legacy of mankind. Is there or is there not something there for us to retrieve? And the best way to do it is to ask not the Egyptologists, indeed to ask the very people who might have been involved in this matter of the legacy, the ancient Egyptians themselves. I propose that tonight we shall let them speak. We shall let the pyramid builders speak to us across time, and they shall speak to us, as you will see, using a most extraordinary and precise language, a language that all of us can understand once we can break into the coding system. And it is very simple, provided that we understand the principles upon which this language is based. So, I want you to imagine yourselves going to Egypt and going to the Giza necropolis, and there undertaking the quest, the search, the investigation, and see where it leads, step by step. There, you are in front of the Giza necropolis, and you meet the great Sphinx of Giza, keeper of the necropolis. Behind him is the so-called second pyramid of, supposedly, as Graham explained, the pharaoh Khafra, who reigned in 2500 BC or so. And you wonder, you look at this and you wonder, because that's what this is about, is to provoke an enormous question in your mind. What is this? Who left this? What for? The same pyramid, illuminated these days by the sun and light show using laser light. This is about sunset. Now, imagine yourselves right at the top of the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid nearby, it's about somewhere here. And you'll be standing atop and looking down at this site at dawn, on a very special dawn. Here we go. Graham and me perched on top of the Great Pyramid, right at the apex. And we're looking down towards the Sphinx. And here's the pyramid you saw illuminated, the second pyramid, casting shadows with the rising sun, casting the shadow of the rising sun on the spring equinox. This picture was taken by Santa, Graham's wife, on the 22nd of March this year. And we were there for this very specific reason, to look at the rising sun on the spring equinox. Bear this in mind, because it is the rising sun on the spring equinox that holds the ultimate key to the riddle which we hope to unravel tonight. You're looking now from high above to on the site of the Giza necropolis, the three great pyramids all together. Here you have the Great Pyramid, supposedly built by Cheops, the one that you were looking at, the second pyramid. You were standing up there, by the way, looking down this way. And I was pointing somewhere in this direction towards a monument. And here, the so-called third, smaller pyramid. Now, I will dispense with all the measurements and figures concerning these monuments. They're all laid out in detail in my first book, The Orion Mystery, in Fingerprints of the Gods, and indeed also in Keeper of Genesis. So let's dispense with this. But I want you to grasp in your mind the awesome scale of this project, the awesome, gigantic scale that you're looking at here. And to do that, in this picture is the Great Sphinx of Giza. It is as long as a city block, as high as a 10-story building, much higher than this ceiling above me. And it is in this picture. Here it is, like a little dinky toy compared to the three giants in the back. That is what you are looking at here. 15 million tons of material, quarried, hauled, cut into perfect blocks, and raised in perfect geometrical shapes. The Great Pyramid stands 480 feet above ground level. It contains 6.5 million tons of material, set in perfect geometrical shape and set, as you will see soon, in perfect astronomical alignment. And you open your guidebook, you open your Egyptological books that you might have, and the first thing that you're told about these monuments is that they are tombs. They are tombs to house the body of 3 pharaohs. 3 pharaohs who wanted their names, their grandeur, their power to be known forever and forever. That is why they built these monuments, in order that posterity knows how great and powerful they were. That is what you would be told. And here is when you strike the first problem. You're looking inside a graphic representation of the so-called King's Chamber inside the Great Pyramid. This is a graphic representation done by one of the engravers of Napoleon, representing apparently when the Arabs opened the Great Pyramid in the 9th century.